Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I certainly do appreciate you being with me. Now, today, I'm going to take a tiny step back from where I was yesterday. Yesterday, I discussed Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following in light of the ultimate fulfillment of the last three of Israel's feast days. Okay? Well, I really should have started what I'm going to do today first and then do that video, but I really wanted to do that. So, okay, just forgive me for that. And you can see this as a slight digression to more properly set the stage for yesterday's video. Okay? With that in mind, here is something that is so foundationally important. And I want you to know, I was totally, I might even say blissfully, but absolutely ignorant of what I'm about to share with you for a good part of my life. When I discovered this, it was absolutely earth-shattering to me, world-changing, paradigm-shattering to me. A little bit of a backstory. I think most of you are aware by this time. I was raised as a fifth-generation amillennialist in the Church of Christ tradition. Absolutely foundational to the amillennial fellowship in which I was raised, going all the way back to Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, and et cetera, is the view God was through with Israel at the cross. God was through with the law, the Old Covenant law, at the cross. Beginning on Pentecost, God started all over again with the new creation of the church. But after Pentecost, nothing is related to the fulfillment of God's promises, his Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, because remember, he was through with Israel and the law at the cross. Nothing was or is in the traditional churches of Christ, even to this day. Nothing is more fundamentally important to that paradigm than that position. Years and years ago, I was engaged in getting ready for a formal public debate, a second in a series of three, a formal public debate with a fella by the name of Bill Lockwood, a minister in the Churches of Christ. We had agreed that each man could ask the other a series of written questions to be answered on paper, prior to the debate. One of the questions that I asked Bill Lockwood, and I submitted it to him opening night of the debate, handed him the paper, walked over to his table, handed him the paper. One of the questions was, are your eschatological hopes based upon, taken from, God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? Well, remember, he's supposed to get this back to me before the debate actually starts. And he sat there, and he sat there, and he sat there, and he sat there with his moderator. And it's time for the debate to begin. And he hadn't answered the question, hadn't brought it back to me. I finally had to walk over there. Again, the debate's ready to start. Had to walk to his table. I said, hey, where's the answers to my questions? And he goes, shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. Oh, yeah, here they are. There were actually a list of several questions, but I was interested in one. The question about Israel, the law. and eschatology. Out beside the question, great big bold letters, no, quotation marks, exclamation, 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 underline, underline, underline. So I got up. I basically ignored all the other questions that I had asked him. And I pointed out, by the way, Bill Lockwood has changed since that debate. He was arrogant. He was caustic. He was acerbic. He was not pleasant to deal with. But I met him 2 or 3 years ago, and Bill has a wonderful demeanor now. We still disagree. But he has a totally, totally different attitude now. And for that, I'm thankful. It was a pleasure to be with him 2 or 3 years ago. So anyway, I got up, and in a series of charts, I presented quote after quote after quote after quote from the New Testament writers writing after the cross, writing after the Pentecost, in which they said their eschatological hope was the anticipation of the fulfillment of Moses, Samuel, yea, and all of the prophets who have ever written. Acts 3, 19 to 24. How Paul said that his doctrine of the resurrection, as he stood on trial for his doctrine of the resurrection, he said, let me testify of something, brethren. I stand and am judged this day according to the resurrection, concerning which hope these men all agree. I believe all things that are written in the law and the prophets, that there is about to be a resurrection of the just and the unjust. I quoted Paul in Acts 26. And now, having obtained help from God, I stand before both small and great, testifying no other things than what Moses and the prophets said should come, that Christ would be the first to be raised from the dead and proclaim life and light to the Gentiles. I pointed out how Peter said, 2 Peter chapter 3, that his doctrine of the day of the Lord was from the Old Covenant prophets who had spoken beforehand. 2 Peter chapter 3. 1 through, the whole chapter. I pointed out how in the book of Revelation is about the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies from Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Malachi. The book of Revelation contains some 400 allusions, citations, echoes of the Old Testament. So chart after chart after chart, I presented the reality that New Testament eschatology is nothing but the reiteration of, the anticipation of, the imminent fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And I turned to my opponent, Bill Lockwood, and I said, you just told us you do not preach your eschatology. You do not draw your eschatology. Your eschatology is not based upon the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Israel. Paul, Peter, James, John, all of the New Testament writers say their eschatology was in fact taken from, based upon nothing other than the Old Testament. That means that you, Brother Lockwood, are preaching a different doctrine. He never said one word in response for the duration of that debate. We had another debate in Spring, Texas, a year later. I pointed out the same thing, how he never answered in the second debate. He ignored every single chart that I presented. He ignored every word that I said about the New Testament source, the Old Testament source for New Testament eschatology. Until the very last speech of the debate, which was his speech. Okay. ignored every argument that I made until in the very last speech of the debate, he got up and said, now, concerning Don's argument on the law and eschatology, it may be that in the churches of Christ, we haven't studied this issue enough. But that doesn't mean Don Preston is right, because he's a false teacher and a heretic. Now, obviously, I had no ability or opportunity in that debate to respond. Very quickly, in one of my books, written years ago, I said, after pointing out all of these New Testament passages that quote from and that say they were anticipating the imminent fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, I pointed out and I said, there are no new eschatological promises or prophecies in the New Testament. Now, are there different nuances? Is there additional information? Sure, nobody denies that. There are no new eschatological prophecies in the New Testament. They are all the anticipation of the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. In a formal debate that I had with another Church of Christ minister in 2008 by the name of John Welch, another very acerbic, caustic, hateful Church of Christ minister, he got up and read from that book. My quote from that book. And he simply closed it and said rather arrogantly, have you ever read or heard anything so ridiculous in all of your life? Well, I got up, presented my charts. He never said another word about it. Now, what does all of this mean, ladies and gentlemen? I've told a couple of anecdotes here for illustration purposes, but here's what this means. The source of Jesus' eschatology was from the Old Testament. You know, Matthew chapter 25, the coming of the Lord for the wedding, right straight out of Hosea 5 and 6. The return of Yahweh to Israel in judgment. How many passages could we cite? Isaiah 45, on and on and on it goes. Psalms 97. So I presented those charts, and I turned to him and I said, you deny that the New Testament doctrine of eschatology is from the Old Testament. Every New Testament writer says their eschatology was from the Old Testament. That means you are preaching a different gospel than that which Paul, the apostle, and the rest of the New Testament writers proclaimed. He never said another word. Now, ladies and gentlemen, since Jesus' eschatology, since the doctrine of the judgment is from the Old Testament, as we have demonstrated repeatedly, that means that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is a prophecy about the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Well, let's see, you have the gathering of the nations for the judgment, right straight out of Joel chapter 3. In those days, last days, and at that time, day of the Lord, I will gather together all nations to judgment. When would that be? Well, Joel 3, 20 and 21, at the time of the avenging of the blood of the martyrs. When was that? Jesus was very emphatic in the judgment of Israel in AD 70. So that brings us down to this reality. If Matthew 25, 31 and following is not fulfilled, then God is not through with Old Covenant Israel. If Matthew 25, 31 and following is not fulfilled, the Old Covenant, every jot, every tittle, remains in effect. Are you willing to go there? I don't think so. But that's what appealing to Matthew 25 proves. Unless you can prove that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is not drawn from, is not based on the old covenant promises of the coming of Yahweh to gather the nations to judgment at the time of the avenging of the martyrs and the establishment of the kingdom. Okay? Hey, I am out of time. Thanks so much for joining me. Get a copy of my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. I cover an awful lot of this and even more. Mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook. I'll refund your shipping. Okay, don't forget, tomorrow we continue our examination of the objections to my brand new book, Temple to Telos. We're getting down close to the final objections that have been offered. And so don't miss that. And then Friday, of course, we'll continue our study, review and refutation of Steve Gregg's book, Why Not Full Preterism. Got a full week. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you on the flip side.